Wow, it's amazing that all of you have come out at this hour of the morning on a Sunday and so forth. And I confess that that is a big surprise, but a real treat. And so I have to thank you so very much for being here and for listening. And I hope I make it somewhat worthwhile over the next few minutes. My goal, or at least the assignment I was giving, was to talk about the publishing business 5 to 10 years out. And I hope I can address that, but I'll have to disappoint you because I think we're going to have to look backwards in order to look forwards. And so we're going to do a bit of that. But let's start out with where we are. I mean, the place that we're at right now, in my opinion, with intellectual property, is that we're in a form of Tarzan economics. That's how I like to refer to it. And I say that because substantially we cling to the vine that keeps us off the jungle floor every day. And that's the sale of products. That's the old vine to which we cling. But even more important, of course, is grabbing that next vine that will in some way propel us forward. And so that's what this talk is going to be about, is how we let go of that old vine that supports us and move forward by grabbing that next vine. And that's a tough spot to be in because, for the most part, we live in a time where it is voluntary to pay. And that can be tough to deal with, especially when the old vine is one of product. Now, I don't pretend that somehow it is legally voluntary to pay. Those of you who are attorneys and those of you who consult them know that it is not legally voluntary to pay. And if we had a number of priests up here or rabbis or so forth, they would say it's not morally right not to pay. It's not voluntary to pay. But in fact, it is a choice that people make. They choose whether they are going to pay or not, and increasingly that choice becomes more viable for them. But I will say that the greatest battle this industry faces, I will say the greatest battle that we have as we create a sustainable economy of ideas, is not with pirates. The greatest battle that we have is for a limited amount of time on a clock and a limited amount of money, especially for discretionary spending in the average wallet. And it's there that the competition is most keen. I say that because when I was growing up, of course I could say I will spend some money on music or I will spend some money on a book. But if I was growing up today, first I would have a cell phone. I would have some kind of internet connection. I would have devices and so forth that I had to spend my money on before I got to the content that I put inside of the thing. And so, yes, there is a battle over piracy. There is a battle over making it not voluntary to pay. But this is not our greatest battle. Our greatest battle is that competition for the time on the clock, for a limited amount of money in the wallet. Now, if we're going to look at the future of publishing, if we're going to look at the future of where these things are going, we do have to look backwards a bit. And here I want to bring up a name that was very, very important in the past, but people have forgotten who he is at this point. And in fact, when I told the organizers of the conference that I was going to talk about Marshall McLuhan, one of them said, well, why would you talk about an obscure American general? And yet, McLuhan, of course, he never fought a war. McLuhan, Toronto professor, loved England, by the way, was quite the Anglophile. But he was a keen observer, and some say the very first professor of media studies in the history of the world. And McLuhan said that you really could never understand the media of your time, that you couldn't understand it because it's a lot like understanding the air that we breathe, or for a fish, understanding the water. David Foster Wallace, in his talk to a college commencement, he said, there are these two fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way who nods at them and says, morning, boys, how's the water? And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one looks over at the other and says, what the hell is water? McLuhan, he referenced this, of course not David Foster Wallace. McLuhan said that people are beginning to understand the nature of their new technology, but not nearly enough of them and not nearly well enough. Most people still cling to what I call the rear view mirror view of the world. By this I mean to say that because of the invisibility of any environment during the period of its innovation, man is only consciously aware of the environment that has preceded it. In other words, an environment becomes fully visible only when it has been superseded by a new environment, and thus we are always one step behind in our view of the world. And so I suggest to you that if we are to understand the next 5 to 10 years of publishing, it would require not that we gaze into a crystal ball or bring a prognosticator, but that we look backwards. And fortunately, history is replete with good examples. And I know it is fashionable to think that we live in very, very special times, that we are somehow blessed, those of us who live in a time of dot-com fever, to be in a very different time. And I don't think it's true at all. In fact, I think that the transition from mechanical to electric was far more savage than the transition from electric to digital. I think the transition from mechanical to electric was indistinguishable from magic. The whole notion that we could broadcast sound and then moving pictures during the 1920s, 1910, this was a revolution. This was something that we truly had difficulty grasping. Handling the transition from electric to digital is merely a gradation of change by comparison. And so there's a lot that we can look at when we look backwards. And we can look at Gutenberg, right? I mean, any discussion of advancements in technology, media technology especially, have to proceed with an acknowledgement that Gutenberg was the most important development before our times. And then let us remind ourselves that Gutenberg was definitely a pirate. Gutenberg was a pirate of the Pope. Gutenberg got started pirating papal indulgences. Basically, flowing script on a piece of paper that said you had the right to sin and still get into heaven. Now, Gutenberg figured out that you didn't have to have scribes and colored paints and all sorts of things, that he could build a press that could make a papal indulgence. And he figured that was a pretty good business, selling the right to sin and still getting into heaven. Now, the Pope did not like that very much, and honestly, it turns out to be true that Gutenberg's venture capitalist was his brother-in-law, and upon pressure from the church, he seized Gutenberg's press and did penance by printing Bibles thereafter. Gutenberg was definitely a pirate. And the library at Alexandria, that was definitely piracy right there. I mean, they carried books on ships into the port at Alexandria, and they seized all of the books off of the ship, returning only the copies of the books to build the biggest library in Alexandria. Piano rolls were considered to be clearly a form of piracy, and by the way, they were the very first digital medium. When you think about it, there's either a whole or there's not, and those were definitely zeros and ones. Jazz itself came to the world only through disintermediation that was little different at the time from piracy. And in fact, jazz was declared in the Saturday Evening Post of 1923 not to be music at all. It was considered merely an irritation of the nerve endings of the ear. And RCA Victor, which created the lateral cut disc, refused to allow jazz to be released at all on their lateral cut discs until they were sued by a little company in Indiana called Gennett that said, we want the right to make lateral cut discs too. And a judge named Learned Hand, a federal district court judge, said, you've got the right to make them. And the first two they brought out were Jelly Roll Morton and Louis Armstrong. And you might think that's coincidence, that new technology brought new culture. Then how do you explain that the very first talking picture was The Jazz Singer by Al Jolson? This was on popular culture that found its way to the masses through an opening in technology. So it is that culture finds its way through these openings in some very, very good ways. I will say that if we look to the past to try to understand where we are going, we have to take a look at Bourget, the great composer, who went to the Ambassador's restaurant on the Champs-Élysées in Paris and heard his music being played by the orchestra without his permission. And so he left without paying for his meal after eating it. He was arrested, taken before a judge who said, you must pay for the food, but admonished the restaurateur that the restaurateur must pay for the music. And so Bourget found himself in league with Henri de Balzac and Victor Hugo, who had recently gotten passed a law in France against the public reading of books without permission. Together they formed Agence Centrale, which became SACEM in the music business, and now there are hundreds of performing rights organizations around the world. And so the lesson to be learned is that when actual control begins to fail us, as a society, we do not answer with more control. We actually move towards actuarial economics, a fancy phrase to describe a pool of money and a fair way to split it up. And so it is that restaurants and radio stations and others can play music without asking for permission, merely by paying into a pool. If we can predict anything, it is that the losses of actual control in the publishing business will lead, and has already led, to similar pools that will have to grow to accommodate incentivizing creativity and the distribution and delivery of these materials. You have analogs all around the world. We have the Copyright Clearance Center in the United States, which compensates for the effect of photocopy machines by collecting from those public institutions and private institutions that own them, putting them into a pool, and distributing the proceeds amongst book publishers, especially of STEM materials, of science, technical, educational materials, medical materials, etc. In order that this approach works, that actuarial approaches work, there must be registries. We must know who to distribute the money to. We must know who owns these works and their provenance, and we must record this information. And while you've been doing pretty good at it in the book business, you've not been doing anywhere near good enough. And we'll have to do better with books and music and all manner of creativity. Rights unenumerated are rights disrespected. And you now live in a global world where these rights must be aggregated from hundreds of countries. When one is doing business on the internet, I don't need to tell you, that content can end up anywhere. And in order to do business with respect, you need to know the status of works all across the planet. And so it is not enough to have a national registry or to record a small amount of information. And the public, too, wants this information in order to stimulate them to buy more things, to find connections between them, in order to research and so forth. It will be necessary that we develop an ISBN and a Dewey Decimal System for the future. And if it is to be for the future, it will be a tough challenge to meet the move in creativity, which is shifting from the center of networks, from radio stations or book publishers or television head ends or movie studios, shifting from the center of the network to the network's edge, to people who do not know about the need to go to a book publisher or to a radio station to deliver materials. And so licensing and clearance and payment will have to move from the center of networks out towards their edge. That will be a very important move. Quite simply, we need to make it faster, easier, and simpler to pay for content in hopes that when it is, more people will. And you don't need to look too much further than Amazon and its one click to realize that the easier it is to pay, the more often people do pay. In my work for Nokia, we had a rule. Every time someone has to click a button, you lose half your audience. If that's true of licensing, we've got problems, because it's a lot more than one click to get a license. We've got to make it super simple to get through that task. If you have trouble understanding what's going on in this digital world, think of it as bionomic. Think of it as a fusion of economics and biology. The rising tide of digitization is a lot like the rising tide of a river, and it forms a shorter path from source to destination, whether we like it or not. That's what's happening around us. And those effects will be dramatic. They will not be found on hit titles. They'll be found in how we bring dead art back to life, books that are no longer published, how new art will come to life that never had a life otherwise. And we know that because creativity is coming from the edge. And that brings us to unusual art. So it will not be the hit titles. It will be dead art, new art, unusual art that changes the world that happens around us and brings us things that we never saw before. This will require that an industry traditionally run by men needs to think like a woman. And I say that because as a man, I will tell you that too often we think about consummating relationships with consumers ad seriatim without so much as finding out their names. It's our idea of a good Saturday night. But let me tell you that I have learned in my long lifetime that real value comes from a feminization of marketing that starts relationships that never end, that are not consummated quickly without the exchange of information by passing a book over a counter at Christmas time in return for a credit card or a $20 bill. It's far more important to fill your file of facts with information and start relationships with those who use your things as they move from product to service. So we will have to think like women. And let me tell you, in that analogy, Amazon is a woman because it remembers what you bought and the color of your eyes and your phone number, and it stays in touch with you. And that's a challenge for us men. We're going to have to figure that out if we want a sustainable economy of ideas. My rule is that information technology, media technology works this way. That if it happens in your life between the time you are born and the time you are 13 years old, it is a natural thing and it is normal. And if this change in media technology happens between the age of 13 and maybe 30 or 40 or 50 if you're lucky, you make it a career. It's so interesting, this new digital world. But if it happens in your life after age 30 or 40, probably you think it should be banned. It should be illegal. So disgusting is it? So unusual is it? So different is it? And so I can tell you that people who are 13 now are going to be 23 10 years from now. That math works out right. And as that moves forward, they will find the things you find aberrant extraordinarily normal. And they will not only make businesses out of it, over time, they will come not to care at all. It will just seem so normal to them. The tough parts are that we've got a real dilemma. And we're stuck in it, in a good way and in a bad way. And that is that, on the one hand, truly we cannot take the stuff. A civilized society cannot long tolerate purely voluntary payment for art, knowledge, innovation, culture, intelligence. That cannot be left to a tip jar. And yet, at the same time, neither can access to these things be conditioned on the size of one's wallet, or worse still, on the size of one's parents' wallet. And so we are left to balance, not seek justice or talk about rights. We are left with a balance. And it is a wonderful thing, this balance, that equalizes access to knowledge and art and culture and innovation. We are driven and fed by libraries. They do not deprive us of a fair income. So it is important that we figure out how to resolve this dilemma. And we need to do it fast, because increasingly, the internet is God. I say this not to shock, but to point out that people tithe more to the internet than they do to their church. That increasingly our tallest buildings are wrapped in ads for ISPs and not topped with steeples. That people confess their deepest secrets to a search engine instead of to a priest. And that unfettered access to this new thing topples governments and displaces leaders. Truly, the internet is our religion. And it's being practiced in different places. We will have to succeed in the next 5 to 10 years in the BRICS countries, in Brazil, in Russia, in India, in China, in South Africa, with different languages and different character sets if we are to be successful. Because though these economies for IP are smaller now than is Spain, over the next 2 decades, they will become bigger than the G8. And so this is where we will have to take this struggle. And as we do, I will leave you with a closing thought, and that is that we will do a lot better in these places with an open hand than we ever will with a closed fist. We can hold more in that open hand, and we can hold almost nothing in a closed fist. So I thank you deeply for your attention. I hope I have hit the time limit, and I welcome now this next speaker, who's a really interesting guy. I met him back in the room in preparation, and I think you're really lucky to have Andrew Steele here. Thank you.